Good evening and welcome to the Tuesday, July 23rd, 2024 study session of the Olympia City Council. For the record, we have a quorum with Councilmember Cooper excused this evening, and Mayor Pro Tem Nguyen and Councilmember Gilman will be making their way to the table shortly. I'm getting like a feedback from my mic. I'm not sure what's going on there, but
I think Kelly's on it.
okay. All right. Before we move on to our business item for this evening, which is a briefing on experiences of discrimination in Olympia report, I'd like to start with a round of introductions. So why don't we begin at the end of the table with Councilmember Parsley.
I'm Lisa Parsley, council member.
Hi, I'm Clark Gilman. It's nice to see you again, and this time in person.
Robert Vanderpool, City Council Member.
Danny Madrone.
Stacey Ray, Interim Assistant City Manager.
Ian Quinn, Mayor Pro Tem. Dr. G in the flesh. Love to see you here.
Jay Verdi, City Manager. Good to see you both again.
Mark Barber, City Attorney.
And Debbie Sullivan, Assistant City Manager.
Dane Wolfram from Truclusion.
Dr. Ashley Gardner from Truclusion, also known as Dr. G in the flesh.
Toby Hillmeyer, and this may be new to you, but I've just recently become the ADA and Accessibility Coordinator for the city.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, all right. So that takes us to our item for the study session this evening, which is a briefing on experiences of discrimination in Olympia report. And I'll turn it over to Toby Hillmeyer, who is our Social Justice and Equity Program Manager and also now has a new title as well. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so just to give you some background about how we got to having this assessment and this report done, it was requested by the Social Justice and Equity Commission, and in great part because when the Social Justice and Equity Commission was created 2.5 years ago now, we had a specific purpose and a specific scope of work. And you can see up here, the purpose is to eliminate racism and fulfill human rights for a just and equitable Olympia for all people. And the scope of work focused on 3 areas, doing mediation and investigation of instances of discrimination. The goal was for that to be similar to a Human Rights Commission, and then advisory to the City Council and staff, and outreach with community. Almost immediately, we ran into difficulties when we found that the authority to act like a semi-judicial body and be a human rights commission, there's a state law, an RCW, that restricts that authority only to municipalities with a population of over 125,000. And so it was clearly suddenly something we could not even approach. But we wanted to be able to follow through on the spirit and the intention of that, as well as our purpose, and more broadly figure out how can this commission have a role in addressing discrimination, combating discrimination in some way. And in trying to figure out what way to go, we quickly realized that it was pretty much all guesswork and gut feelings, and that we didn't actually have any data on what was happening in Olympia. You know, maybe some data what's happening in the country or in Washington State, but not in Olympia. And that's where this report came in. And so tonight you're going to get to see a bit of the methodology and how we created this report, and also just go through the content of the report. Tonight is really an opportunity to learn, to understand what the report says and doesn't say, and then At the end of the presentation, we'll ask for your reflections, observations, hopes that may come from this work. And I also want to encourage all of you to ask questions throughout the whole presentation. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our research team with Truclusion. We have Dane Wolfram, the senior manager, Dr. Ashley Gardner, the principal researcher. On Zoom, we have Ian Folino, the managing principal, as well as two of the three subject matter experts, Marv Jones and Lorena Narjaro. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Toby. So, like Toby said, myself, Dane, and then a couple of people from the Truclusion team will be on Zoom, so we will kind of be going back and forth a little bit, okay? So this is really what you're going to get from our team, as Toby briefly described. First, we're going to go through the methodology, and then we're going to give you a little bit of high-level findings, and then get straight into the themes and the intervention points. So before we get into the methodology and the major findings, we think it's incredibly important for us to consider the various interactions that exist in Olympia. So really thinking about the ways in which this survey was designed, we focused in on how community members interact with each other and systems. Now, identifying these 4 interactions are incredibly important, because when thinking about interventions, we must name who this intervention is impacting. All right, so that's really the main purpose of this slide here for you all. Okay, so now let's get into how did we carry out this study. All right, so considering the purpose of this research, as Toby briefly talked about, was to understand how people perceived how they experienced discrimination, we utilized a mixed methods methodology. And so essentially we utilized a survey, which we've seen the survey, but then also follow-up interviews to provide context for that quantifiable data. So the survey that we used was called the Everyday Discrimination Scale, and we selected it for many reasons, but the main reasons was, number one, it's one of the most widely used assessment tools in research for trying to understand how people experience discrimination. But then additionally, it was very intentional on assessing those structural, those systemic items in discrimination, as well as people's everyday acts of discrimination. All right, so then ultimately, once we decided, okay, we're going to use that scale, we got approval from the Institutional Review Board, which is like the FDA, Ethics Board of Research. And then we moved forward with our Yin, going in and really getting into the Olympia community to spread the word about the survey. The survey is here, and we want to make sure that this survey is accessible to all. And so Yin was very intentional on getting into the community to make sure that the marginalized voices were amplified. And so ultimately, we ended up getting a little bit under 2,000 survey responses, which just as a rule of thumb is more than enough data to make scientific statistical conclusions. But then also, again, talking to Yin's intentionality on getting the marginalized voices, it also reflected Olympia, which is the entire point and purpose and goal of doing scientific research in communities and cities. And so if we're looking at this slide here, what I really want to highlight, because you'll see the more profound, expounded upon version, I believe on page 37 on your report, if we all have the beautiful report in front of us. Isn't it pretty? First of all, Dane did this. I'm sorry. But Dane did this. I have to give Dane props. Great job. Okay, so page 37 of the report, you'll see the actual demographic layout of our respondents. But I want to really highlight how we had our respondents were about 26% of those people had a disability, 21% of those people identified as something other than white, and then I believe 27% of our respondents identified as LGBTQ+. So again, just speaking to our intentionality of really making sure that we were really being as, I guess, diverse, what's the word I'm trying to use? As diverse as possible. Thank you. All right, so now I want to get into data analysis. I don't want to bore you all with data analysis. However, what I do want to talk about is this graph here, because we use a statistical analysis technique called a regression. And a regression essentially tells us how likely an identity is to experience a form of discrimination within our data. So this example here, I really want to help you all understand how to read it. So this example here describes how likely a person in Olympia will say their life has been made harder because of discrimination in Olympia. So the data you see here is really based on that question. And so if we start at the baseline, right, the baseline as is at the bottom in the left, you'll see the baseline will always be a white cisgender Christian man with no reported disabilities. So according to our data, cisgender women are 41% more likely than a white cisgender Christian man with no reported disabilities to say their life has been made harder because of discrimination. Now, when thinking about intersectionality, this chart is cumulative. So cisgender women that identify as Hispanic or Latina are 41 plus 92, 133% more likely to say their life has been made harder because of discrimination, okay? The last piece about this chart I think is incredibly important for you all to realize is we look at all of the identities on the left side of the screen, right? Now, if you do not see an identity on the left side of that screen, all that means is that our data, essentially, our data wasn't statistically significant enough to make statistical conclusions, okay? So that does not mean that they did not experience this. All that means is that our data was not statistically significant enough either way. Okay, I just want to make that clear. So as we go through and you see graphs like this, all that means is that the data wasn't statistically significant enough either way. All right, so any questions about this slide? I was supposed to ask questions about the last slide and I forgot. You're supposed to tap me. He didn't.
Mayor Pro Tem Nguyen.
Thank you. Dr. Gardner, could you repeat, what did you say at the end there about statistical significance?
Yes, so if we look at the identities that are on the left side of the screen, those identities essentially, according to our data, was statistically significant enough to make scientific conclusions here. So if you don't see an identity on the left side of the screen, all that means is the data was not statistically significant enough to make statistical conclusions, all right? So again, that does not mean that an identity that's not on the left side of the screen did not say their life has been made harder because of discrimination. All that means is using the regression, the statistical analysis technique, the data was not statistically significant enough.
And I'll jump in to share as well that part of that this regression is a very specific mathematical technique, and you'll see other data throughout the rest of the presentation as well. But as you can see on the bottom of the screen, the confidence levels are 95% or above. So something might have had a confidence level of 94%, and then it wouldn't have been on this chart.
And we had a lot of that, so yeah. Thanks for that, like a true researcher. Okay, so,
I was just going to say thank you. I did turn to page 37 in the report, like you were saying, and am seeing more identities than up there, so that's helpful.
All right, any more questions about this slide before I move forward? Yeah.
Councilmember Madrone.
So some of these identities could overlap. So, you know, a cisgender woman could be of any race. So could you talk a little bit about how that teases out?
Yes, so like I said a little bit earlier, it's cumulative. So really considering, like, for example, if a black cisgender woman, that would be cumulative. So whatever that number is, 320, thank you, because even though I have glasses, I still can't see. So that would be 225 plus 41. So it's cumulative, essentially. Yeah.
Just a curiosity, how close is on page 37 the demographics match the most recent census for Olympia? And is there any glaring absences?
This is Dane. I think so. We're within. I think we're within scientific kind of like whatever. There is, I would say, the biggest kind of noticeable miss is that the Asian population in the survey might have, and I don't even want to tell you what it is. I can look it up, but it's lower. It's significant enough for us to get some data. about experiences, but it is not representative, like fully representative of the city. Whereas just about every other group was a lot close. You know, if you think about like standard deviation, that was the one that kind of stuck out the most. And what I can do is I can kind of look up what that range was. But okay.
All right, is that it for this slide? Okay. So now we are going to get into some specific questions. And so if any of you all saw our actual survey, one thing it was not was short. Okay, so because of that, to really simplify the digestibility of the report, we kind of categorized our questions into two categories. Okay, and so the first category we call discriminatory acts of diminishment. And so that can be defined as acts that diminish or devalue one's standing in the community based on an identity or identities they have. So we assessed 4 acts of diminishment in our survey, and we measured those as being treated with less respect, others acting afraid of you, being harassed or threatened, and being seen as less smart. So to give you an example of one of those questions in the survey, we asked, in your day-to-day life in Olympia, how often have people acted as if they think you are not smart? Okay, so those are the type of questions that we asked, teasing out to those 4 different areas in the acts of diminishment. Okay, so considering all of those, a couple of key takeaways from this slide. First things first, I think is that first percentage there where it says 86.2% of our respondents reported experiencing diminishment discrimination. So 86.2% of our respondents, which essentially extrapolates to 47,000 Olympians, said that they experienced diminishment discrimination due to their gender, right? Due to 16.3% said due to their age, 10.8% of them said due to their race, 17.2% of them said due to their physical appearance, right? Another thing that this slide talks about is the frequency of these experiences. And so if you look on the right side here of this slide, it says essentially 38% of people, which is 20,000 Olympians, if we extrapolated, experience diminishment discrimination a few times a month or more. Okay, so that's really what this slide is all about. So any questions, again, high level, but I just wanted to talk about that briefly. Okay. I feel like if I stay there too long, questions will eventually come up, but we'll get back to it. Okay, so now we'll go over to the second category, the second and last category of questions, in which we call discriminatory acts of impediment, which can be defined as impeding an individual's access to opportunities because of an identity or the identities that they have. So we're really talking about those systemic elements, so those barriers in education, healthcare, employment, etc., that you'll see up there. So an example of one of those questions would be, was in our survey, how many times were you prevented from renting or buying a home in the neighborhood you wanted in Olympia because of your identity? And then we followed up with, what do you think was the main reason for this experience, listing all of their identities. Okay, so that's kind of what that looks like. And so looking at the slide here, what it says is over half of our respondents, which was 51.5%, which also extrapolates to about 28,000 Olympians, indicated that they experienced this type of discrimination, impediment discrimination in education, healthcare, employment, housing, etc., due to 24.8% of them said their gender, 14.9% of them said their age, 11.1% of them said their race, and so on. Okay, and then if we also look at this right side as well, these were not one-off experiences most of the time. These happen multiple times according to Olympians. So any questions? Okay, so we are going to hand it off to Lorena, who is on Zoom.
Thank you, Dr. Gardner. So the next chart highlights the correlation between people experience diminishment discrimination and impediment discrimination. As Dr. Gardner mentioned a minute ago, forms of diminishment discrimination include being treated with less respect, being seen as less smart, being threatened or harassed, and people acting afraid. 15% of Olympia community members who experience no discrimination.
Lorena?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt. This is Mayor Payne. So we can't see the presentation. So are you able to share your slide as you present?
I don't have, one moment, please. Let me get that for you.
Okay. Okay. Okay, we have it up here in the chambers. We just can't see you, but we can hear you.
Oh, okay.
So you can keep moving.
I could keep moving.
Yes,
Okay,
you can.
great.
Thank
Thank you. Yeah, no problem. So 15% of Olympia community members who experience no diminishment reported experience some form of impediment discrimination. 45% of those who experience one or two forms of diminishment also experience impediment discrimination. 66% of those who experience three forms of diminishment also experience impediment discrimination. And 79% of those who experience all four forms of diminishment discrimination also experience impediment discrimination. So this is what the chart reflects. The chart that you see, I can't, and I'm sorry about that. There it is. All right. So thank you, whomever is handling the charts and navigating that on Zoom. Thank you so much.
Are there any questions? Thank you, Lorena. Before we explore some comparisons to national data, I do want to express some risks in comparing Olympia's research findings to other studies, which are really just a result. These risks are kind of a result of the fact that Olympia is leading this work. If you were 20th to do this, then we'd have lots of benchmark data to look at. But really similar published research looking at a community or a city as a whole in the U.S. has not been done. Specific to diminishment discrimination, so those forms of being seen with less respect, being seen as less smart, being harassed or threatened, and then people acting afraid of you. We found 470 published studies that have used the same tool that we used, the same study instrument, and none of them studied a community or a city like this in the US. As far as impediment discrimination, we do have one national study that was done, and the slide says 2018, was published in 2018, but the piece of work was 2017. So you might see both numbers. The 2017 study of impediment discrimination measured experiences in employment, healthcare, housing, and law enforcement. And that is what you'll see on the next couple of slides, but it's also in the report that we gave you. The study does have some things that I just want to draw into attention. First, the national data did not include Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, or mixed race as racial options. The national data had 6% of respondents self-report as LGBTQ, whereas the Olympia research had 28%. The national data had only 1% of respondents self-report as transgender or non-binary, compared to 10% in Olympia. Sexual orientation experiences were not separated out from transgender or oppression experiences, so both of those are put together in LGBTQ. And then the national study did not include age, disability, or religion. So that being said, diving in, and this first slide is on employment. I'm gonna actually go into some more concerns and just kind of show you kind of what we look at when we're seeing this. So Olympia in the light blue, on this slide is missing about a quarter of the BIPOC residents that we surveyed, because mixed race individuals, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders are not included in this. And so that's right, like mixed race individuals are about 19% of our data, of the BIPOC population that we studied, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander was about 5%. And so that's about a quarter of folks that are not represented here. And we don't know if they had to choose one of these 5 racial categories where they would put themselves. So it's really hard to predict how the light blue would change for race. Also, since Olympia LGBTQ plus community includes about 10 times more trans and non-binary individuals than the national study, and 38% of the Olympia transgender non-binary respondents reported this type of discrimination, it's really hard to say, it's really hard to compare the local and national data are parallel. And so it's really hard, you know, when those two things are put together, we don't know how that's impacting that 27% or that 20%. And then another thing you might see is the national study, cisgender men and cisgender women were about a 48 to 52% split, so almost an even split, whereas in the Olympia study, and this goes to your question, I should have mentioned this, we had about a 2-to-1 cis women versus cis men response rate in Olympia. And so about 67% of our respondents were cis women, and well, of the cisgender folk, 67% were women and 33% were men. And so that causes a really strong influence on the white racial information. And what you'll see on all 4 of these slides is that white number is very comparable to the women number. And that's because like it's a really, and over 80% of the women, of cis women were white, identified as white, right? So you're gonna see that. So I would caution you to look at this and go, oh, we have more white race, you know, anti-white racism in the city than we do nationally. Like, I think that's a really dangerous assumption. I think it has to do with women. And if you look at the cis women numbers, then that makes a lot more sense. So that being said, there is still a chart here. And if there's any questions, I'll entertain them.
Not so much as a question, but just a thank you, because we received part of this presentation in community livability and public safety, myself, Mayor Pro Tem Nguyen, and Councilmember Gilman. And I was curious about what this information in front of us was saying compared to national data. So I'm surprised, but not surprised that once again, Olympia is leading the way on some of this and actually trying to get to the bottom of what are people's experiences. But I just appreciate you going the extra mile to bring this to us, because it does show that certainly we're doing more work in this regard, but also it's interesting to know that the national data is not capturing a lot of people's experiences in this way. And I think that's important, not just for us to know, but our community to know as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Parsley.
2 questions. One, did they pull out the people that feel that they are discriminated against due to disabilities? Because that may be skewing some of our numbers as well nationally. And then, do you know of any other jurisdictions roughly within our range that have begun to look at this across the country? It'd be interesting to see in the future where we stack up, just sort of like, is there something coming?
It's hard to tell if they've begun to look at it, but in terms of research, we had a really hard time finding specifically peer-reviewed scholarly research. Like we said, we haven't seen anything relatively like it, but on the more, I guess, non-publicly scholared, we have seen very few, but not really. To answer your question, it's a large no, but scholarly, absolutely not.
I'll add in for not scholarly work, there's a lot of cities that have had equity assessments, and they ask some of the similar questions, but taken as a whole, it looks very different from what we're looking at in this report.
I guess where my brain is going is if we decide, or the Social Justice and Equity Commission recommend actions or plan, I guess we're going to have to build our own metrics to ourselves and not, I guess that's where we're going.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple things. One, to answer part of your question, disability was not part of the national study, disability, age, or religion. To add on to the conversation that you're having, yeah, to clarify, so there has been research done that's similar, but it looks at gaps, right? It looks at outcomes. It looks at who's living where, who's getting bank loans, by rate and all that. This study was not that. This study was how are people experiencing? So instead of looking at what outcomes are, this was looking at what his experience is. And so I think that that's a key difference. And so like the work you're talking about, the challenging work, is if we want people to experience their life in Olympia differently, then it will be different than just saying, well, you need more people with this identity living in this part of the neighborhood, right? Like you can move around outcomes, but that doesn't necessarily change how people are experiencing and living their life. So good on Olympia for looking at it this way. Anything else on this employment slide? Okay, the next one is healthcare, and basically all of the above comments I made about the races that are missing, the LGBTQ plus community, and then also the influence that cis women have on white still apply here. Are there any questions? Should I move forward? Okay. This one, there is something to note. I think if we want to take a risk and kind of note something about the national comparison, there are gaps here for Asian, Black and African American, Latino, Hispanic, and LGBTQ plus that appear larger than the gaps in the other three slides. So the gaps here are, I hate to use the word significant because that's a scientific term, but in layman's terms, significantly more. And so if we want to assert something, we might be able to say that Olympia, compared to national data, appears to be doing maybe better at lowering discrimination in housing than the other, right? So the gap is larger here. Again, it's really hard though for us to compare. Like we don't really know, but that would be the only thing we can really grab from this. It's also noteworthy for your work because housing might be something you can control more than employment or healthcare. So, questions? Okay, and the last one here is law enforcement and public security discrimination, and it's like the first two. All the same notes. Let me know when you want me to move forward. Okay. And then one more thing to kind of name here is before we dive into the research that we found, like these were some themes that came up from the qualitative interviews that Dr. Gardner's team conducted. And so the first four are about diminishment, right, being disrespected, seen less smart, harassed, and people acting afraid. So the first four themes there are continuing to increase the representation. So these are suggestions of how to kind of remedy that from the community. These are not necessarily our endorsed recommendations. First one is continuing to increase representation. Second, increasing awareness around discrimination that is experienced. Third, fostering relationships with community leaders. And fourth, leaning into the causes of discrimination. The next batch is that impediment discrimination, so specific to employment, education, housing, healthcare, et cetera. The first recommendation from the community was improving public transportation. Second, training and education to the community at large. Third, improving housing and employment experiences. And then lastly, striving to reach equity. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Yen, who is online.
Thank you, Dane. Hi, everybody. My name is Yen Felino. I'm actually on vacation, so I'm not in a very good spot for video conferencing. So you just hear my voice. And here, let's look at colorism reported by our respondents in Olympia. For this report, we define colorism as discrimination against people based on the darkness of their skin tone. In addition to asking people to self-identify their race, we ask them what race strangers most often assign to them. This chart shows that for American Indian, Alaska Native, Hispanic Latino, and mixed race individuals, there was a much lower rate of experiencing discrimination for those who said that strangers generally see them as white compared to those who are seen as other than white. So, for example, Hispanic Latino individuals who are seen as darker than white are 4 times more likely to be treated with less respect than those who are seen as white. Mixed race individuals who are seen as other than white are 7 times more likely than those seen as white to experience this form of discrimination. It's important to note that Asian, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders are not listed here because the data doesn't show or did not show that Asians with lighter skin tone experience less discrimination than Asians with darker skin tones. This does not mean that there isn't a correlation, just one that's not found in this study. Do we have any questions for this slide?
Yes, thank you. And I do have a question about the areas that shows no data for Black African Americans that are generally seen as white. I know that this is something, especially when we're talking about colorism, this is something that we certainly know is a thing in the Black community when it comes to light-skinned Black people. And then I see the same thing over on, it says there's no data for whites that are generally seen as something other than white, which would be those with darker skin that are Caucasian. So why is there no data for those two categories?
So we didn't have any Black respondent that reported that they were seen as white. So the ones that were reported as seen as white were mixed race with some part black, black. So it's the mixed race ones that are seen as white that experience less discrimination. But we did not have any person that identifies as pure Black and not mixed race reported themselves to be seen as white.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if I'm clear.
I see. Thank you. Anybody have any other questions on this slide? All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so the next slide, we want to go into diminishment discrimination reported by Asian Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian. So these findings are based on questions asked if respondents felt being treated with less respect, being seen as less smart, having others act afraid of you, and being harassed or threatened. Our findings show that in comparison to our white respondents, over 5 times the number of Asian, Pacific Islander, and Native Hawaiian individuals reported feeling less respected, and over 15 times of them felt that they're seen as less smart. So to be seen as less smart and treated with less respect often leads to not being included in social spaces like PTA, neighborhood block parties, to receiving inferior services or even hostile services and healthcare. So as an immigrant of 20 years, coming from being part of racial majority in Singapore to being seen as a minority in America, I was not prepared for the prevalence of diminishment discrimination. On the surface, it's easy to say, just brush it off, work harder to prove yourself, or time will prove your intent. Over time, as an active volunteer, even in my own community and my kids' school, I see the effects, and I can see how others feel that they've been afforded less confidence in their abilities, less credit for achievements, and fewer opportunities for growth. Do we have any questions for that?
Councilmember Gilman.
Yeah, and I really appreciate your sharing your own story also. I think this is one where there's not like an obvious policy move, but but the recognition I think is so important that it's I just think that's we were talking earlier today about, like, so what are the actions? And some of the actions are just sitting with this is the reality for people in our community and making room for actions, I think.
Thank you, Councilmember Gilman. And that is so true. Just the fact that um, these this diminishment discrimination is being recognized is really a step towards, um, quote unquote, and I hate to say the word improvement, but something with recognition, people can put a word to it and realize or realize for themselves what can be done. Um, and instead of sweeping under the floor and that's or under the rugs, and that is first step, and we're happy that to be able to have this part of the report on. Thank you. Um, should we move on to the next slide?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Dane?
Thank you, Yen. I think I'm going to take us through here. We are missing a couple team members because of what's going on with the crowd strike and air travel and everything. So, transgender oppression. Just start off by naming that trans women and trans men are separate gender experiences and identities. In the study here, we've combined trans men and trans women as a group because their experiences of discrimination were very similar in quantity, type, and severity. But we do recognize that they're different people. In fact, the data tells us that trans men and trans women experience discrimination at, as Dr. Gardner showed earlier, 976% of the baseline. So it was the highest identity as far as experiencing, and in many of your pages of the report, you will see that it is the identity that experiences the most discrimination. We see throughout this report that they do experience discrimination controlling for other variables. Transgender men and transgender women are 11 times more likely than cisgender men to be denied or provided inferior Medicare or medical care. They're 3 times more likely to be prevented from renting or buying a home in their desired neighborhood, 3 times more likely not to receive a job promotion, 3 times more likely to be hassled by law enforcement or security, 5 times more likely to be discouraged by an educator or advisor from pursuing further education, and 8 times more likely than cisgender men to be denied or provided inferior service by, say, a plumber or a car mechanic or another service provider. Not to call out plumbers in the city of Olympia, but that type of service. The correlation between, any questions on that slide? Okay. The correlation between age, gender identity, and sexual orientation. So the top rows of this chart shows the numbers for gender identity, and the bottom rows show the numbers for sexual orientation. Each pie chart shows the percentage distribution of gender identity within that age group. So from left to right, we have like 24 and under, 28.2%, 25 to 39 years old, 16.2%, 40 to 54, 6%, and 55 plus, 1%. This tracks with what we're seeing nationally, which is younger people have higher percentages of people who are not cisgender compared to older generations. Focusing on the bottom row, we can visualize the same trend with sexual orientation, meaning that there is a higher percentage of non-heterosexual folks in the youngest age group and the lowest percentage of non-heterosexual people in the oldest age group. And I do think it's important, just for context, this is not a thing that changes over age. Like, we're not expecting the people who are the 24 and under cohort that when they're 55 and over, the percentage will look like the 55 and older, right? We're actually expecting, I think internally our team is expecting that the number might go up. We're not expecting it to go down. So this is just kind of a sign of what's happening. And this is not unique to Olympia. In all of our research, we're seeing similar numbers when we're collecting young people. When we're collecting age, we're seeing something similar. Questions on this slide? Okay. I think this might be our last slide. Correlation between age and impact, existent cause of discrimination. So From left to right, we have those born before 1969, born between 69 and 83, and then 84 and 98, and then after 1998. The first chart shows the percentage of each age group who say that discrimination has interfered with them having a full life. That was the last question we asked. Through the whole survey, we did not mention the word discrimination. We asked about experiences until this question, and it was the last question. And we said, how much has discrimination interfered with you having a full life? This trend shows a steady increase from 33.7% to those born before 1969 through to 53.5% of those born after 1998. The second chart shows of the people who said that they had not been impacted, right? So it's not the same group. It's the slice of people who said that they have not been impacted by discrimination. It's the percentage who believe that discrimination does not exist or that they don't contribute to it. So this trend is not a steady increase. We actually have a dip in the number between 1984 and 1990, those born between 84 and 98. And why is this finding significant? When we view these two together, for those who are under 25, 53% of people under 25 say that discrimination has interfered with them having a full life. And at the same time, that same age group has the highest percentage of people who aren't experiencing discrimination say that it doesn't exist or that they don't contribute to it. Okay, so without intervention, this is likely to increase experiences in discrimination. Okay, questions? All good, yeah. It's like a hook. Yep. Okay.
Oh, wait, do you have a question before we move on?
So I'm just wrapping my head around that number at 25 and the 76.9%. I know you broke out in some of your other charts how many feel that discrimination is happening or isn't happening, and am I contributing or am I innocent? Did you break that out in this group at all?
So it's not in the report. We would be able to break it out. If it may be that it's not in the report because it was insignificant, but we're happy to double check if that's something you'd like to know. So what I'm hearing is you want to know for people born after 1998, how many of them said that it doesn't exist and how many said it exists, but I don't contribute to it. Basically, what's that breakdown? Yeah, we could definitely provide that.
Councilmember Gilman.
This is sort of a broader question, as I see we're getting to the end of the show here. I'm wondering what just sort of an initial reaction or language I might use that, in my anecdotal experience, substance users and mentally ill folks or people with mental health, whatever the right word is for that, are very frequently, at best, othered, at worst, just taking verbal abuse on the sidewalk. Is that discrimination by these categories? Is that a different category of thinking and analysis? Because I would just say, in terms of people who have each of these kinds of both of these kinds of discrimination, that at least anecdotally, it looks like they have it heaped on them. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly the specific question in there because, like, for example, we didn't necessarily go to people like the people you describe and study them. We definitely capture, I'm certain that we capture some people who are housing unstable, some people with mental illnesses. We did not ask about drug use per se. So I don't know, I can't parse that out because we didn't, like that's not a thing. If your question is, go ahead.
I can just jump in and share that if you're talking about is that discrimination, definitely 100% it is. And I think like outside of this report, we can anecdotally talk about that it definitely happens. But when we're looking at the legal framework, those aren't protected classes. And so that's part of why they weren't called out as a specific identity in this report. And so the report doesn't really have any conclusions about those populations specifically.
Thank you, Toby. And I didn't expect. I understand that the protected categories are what we're serving, but it's been on my mind that is there a place within this social justice, equity, and belonging sort of work to include the folks who are the least among us, who are getting scorn heaped on them. So.
And I just wanted to thank you for bringing that up, because I'm thinking back from the interviews that I conducted, we had a really strong population from those that were in the unhoused category, and they spoke very passionately about how they perceived that as discrimination. And they really wanted their voices to be amplified through this report in some way, somehow. So I'm so glad that you brought that up.
And I'll also say, as far as asking what language you can use around it, it is definitely discrimination. Is it illegal discrimination? In most cases, no.
So therein is the diminishment versus impediment, because impediment tends to be those kinds of things that have been codified in law, employment, education, housing, and diminishment tends to be things that are not necessarily, but absolutely, right? So think about diminishment, like people act afraid of you. That absolutely, when you're describing the people you're talking about, to me, I can think of a lot of people who are afraid of them, right? Being seen as not smart, being disrespected, yelling at, or harassed even. Those are those forms of discrimination. And if it's being applied because of an identity someone has, then it's discrimination. So if it's because they're unhoused or because they're mentally ill or because, whatever it might be, then that is the reason. If it has to do with a social group identity, basically. So, and that's the diminishment is the challenge, because it's a lot harder to legally address.
It's prejudice versus discrimination. So prejudice is like a feeling. Discrimination is like acting upon that prejudice in an illegal way, right? Yeah. Mayor Pro Tem Nguyen.
Yeah, on this topic, Dr. Gardner, you said that there was a lot of, or a decent amount of housing unstable folks that were interviewed. Is that right? So is there somewhere in this polished report that we would see that? I flipped to the housing area on pages 22 and 23 and didn't see it here, but I wonder if it's somewhere else, or if it or if it was just kind of woven throughout, like we didn't key in on whether they were housing stable or not.
Yeah, so you will see some of those quotes in the housing. I need to go to that page, but you will see some of those quotes in the housing area. But then also in like employment, for example, we had a lot of them we've interwoven into that one as well. But again, just to maintain being anonymous and all of that, we didn't really say who was, unhoused specifically as we weaved in their quotes. But yeah, I'm sure thinking back a year ago, I'm sure I could point out who was who, me just looking at it. But no, in this report, we didn't specifically say who was unhoused, who wasn't, based on the actual quotation.
Yeah, and the housing is specific to like the types of discrimination for housing was like you were turned down from a lease or a loan or unable to get a home loan. I think it was like unable to get a home loan. There are a lot of people who are unhoused who that doesn't necessarily apply, they're experiencing different other types of discrimination, even though that might be part of the reason why they feel like they're doing it. But it was this type of housing discrimination because we're using a different tool, or I mean, we're using a tool that's scientific and we didn't develop, it didn't necessarily give us the freedom to kind of dive in too much, except for in the qualitative interviews.
May I ask a follow-up question? I'm sure it's somewhere within methodology, but can you talk a little bit about how you even got to interviewing those individuals? Like, was it like just an intercept or what did you do?
So you're asking the process, like, how did I get them to be interviewed? Yeah. So at the end, one of the last questions of the survey asked, "Hey, would you be willing to participate in a follow-up interview? If so," we had multiple options: phone number, email. I think it was just phone number and email. But then we reached out to them with information, hey, to schedule an interview, and then we did it via phone, email, or Zoom. So was that your question in terms of like the process of getting them to actually participate in the interview?
Yeah. Well, I think of many
they have
people that participate in something like this. I think it's tougher to reach folks that have less resources. And so I'm impressed, two, realizing my biases about, what access folks that are housing unstable, realizing that they're all different, how they communicate, what they have access to. So, yeah. And then just generally interested in, how these folks are reached out to and stuff.
Absolutely. And the thing about this portion is that it was incentivized, right? So everyone who participated in the interview was a $25 gift card or something like that. And so that really helped in them saying yes. So that's why I'm saying we had a really large population from the unhoused.
Okay. Toby, I believe you had a next steps slide.
Yes, so I just wanted to share a little bit of where do we go from here. And so actually just in a couple of days, we're going to be doing a presentation very similar to this for city staff. And that's going to be an opportunity for city staff to better understand this information and also make some of the connections of where might it be relevant in their work, how they might be able to use it, for example, in doing an equity framework, or even just how they might be able to be more aware of these concerns and then find opportunities as they come up within their existing work that might be able to help turn the curve on these. And then we're also going to be following up with the community partners who helped get the word out about the survey, and specifically inviting them to a focus group discussion, because we want to share this with them, get their kind of like gut check response, but we also want to ask them questions about what work are they doing that might be addressing these issues, and what efforts are happening in Olympia already that we should make sure is on our radar. And then finally, we've got the Social Justice and Equity Commission has a retreat planned for October 5th. And the majority of that retreat is going to be focused on this subject and getting into the discussion of what might be the city's role in addressing discrimination, where there might be things that the city could specifically do, or where the city might support other entities in what they are doing, and to really begin the process of developing a recommendation that will come back to you for how the city can have a role in addressing discrimination.
All right, thank you, Toby. Councilmember Parsley.
It'd be great to just get a report out from that retreat, not the plan, but just what are their next steps, what are they thinking they think is the next best step, or just I guess a report out.
Sure thing, I'll make a note of that.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
And then
Toby.
I also just wanted to say, in addition to any final questions you have, I'd also like to invite you to share any of your own reflections as you've been going through this data, observations you've made, hopes you might have for where we can go from here.
Councilmember Vanderpool.
Yeah, I'm glad we were able to receive this a couple months ago, give or take, and go through it and then come back and go through it. I mean, it's exceedingly difficult as someone who is action oriented and on policy to look at a lot of this stuff, right? I mean, it's difficult because you have so many friends and colleagues and coworkers from here and then out at my day job and people I know out in the community, and I struggle with this because it feels like I wish there was something I could do more in, right? And with that said, I mean, I'd be very interested in seeing who those partnerships are, because the more other organizations that are involved in knowing this, the more paths we can have to having the institutional knowledge, because we looked at other aspects that like healthcare and the school system and other things that are critical, right? My partner Alicia works at St. Peter's, and she has a lot of SI suicide preventative patients that are of younger generation because of the discrimination they deal with. And I frankly believe our community can do better than this. And so I would love to hear more about what ways we can get the other governing bodies involved.
I mean, I think part of it is just like continuing the conversation and taking steps to reach out across jurisdictions. I regularly meet with equity staff from the county and from Lacey and share and discuss these items. As far as your interest in who we reached out to and what community partners we had, I actually have a document on that which lists like 30 or 40 organizations that we reached out to and that we had an opportunity to work with, and I could share that with you if you'd like.
I would appreciate that. I mean, the other part of this that sticks out is how we can integrate this into our other departments of the city. I mean, housing discrimination should be integrated into the way we do planning, right? And the way we hope folks, right? And any other future policies. I mean, we do that in a lot of our reporting for our council meetings, but I feel like it has to be more integrated than that. So I would be open to any other recommendations that come along that.
And hopefully the equity framework will get at some of that and help with that as well.
And I'll say to some degree it already has. Like in some of the conversations I've had with planners that are putting together things like the Triangle Area Plan, they definitely were considering housing discrimination and the impact that that development plan might have on economics for homeowners, for renters, and all those different factors.
Councilmember Madrone, followed by Councilmember Gilman.
Yeah, I've got a lot of thoughts swirling around in my head, and none of them are quite complete. But I did want to say something to appreciate this work that you've done for us. Getting almost 2,000 responses on a survey is pretty significant, to use the term that's been used a lot this evening. And one of the things that I'm thinking about is, when you think about the sphere of influence that we have as a city government, like what are the levers that we can pull, policy levers, resource levers, things like that, to change some of these trends for the better, and also in what ways can we provide support, because we can't control individual behavior, and a lot of this is about individual behavior. So like, where can we be responsive when somebody experiences something, discrimination in our community? It makes me think about the Belonging in Olympia work that Stacy is undertaking here. So that's just some of the things swirling through my head, the different levers that we have to pull and the ways that we can help people feel like they are welcome and they belong in this community, even in the context of all the stuff that we know is happening. So those are my thoughts.
Councilmember Gilman, followed by Councilmember Parsley.
Thank you, Mayor Payne. First, the diminishment and impediment sort on the kinds of ways that people experience discrimination was new for me and has been really useful in my thinking over the last several months. I appreciate that a lot. To the question of what kinds of actions we can take, I think seeing that such a large portion of our community experiences this in life gives me courage and motivation to consider sort of like affirmative, anti-racist, reparations-pointed sorts of actions that I think one of the ways that we address this is to sort of suffuse more equalizing kinds of planks in our legislation as we're looking at do we focus on a particular group or incentivize a particular group in a program that we have for helping with home buying, as an example. So that's what this makes me think about policy-wise, is how do we make sure that we're thinking about transgender folks who are experiencing this on a much more dramatic level, and how are we actively anti-racist as we're shaping programs and deciding where to spend money. So that's how I see it, rather than being specific, here's how we fix somebody being rude on the sidewalk kinds of interventions.
Yeah, that just makes me think of the work, again, that we're doing around Black home ownership in the Regional Housing Council. Thanks, Councilmember Madrone, for the notification. I believe just received an update last night on the Black Homeowners Initiative, or is it tomorrow? Or tomorrow, so it did not happen yet. Obviously, we are currently in the midst of working on the reparations referral, and that's language that's been included in there because I believe goals have been set for King and Pierce counties on the number of homes, for example. And so something like that is something tangible that we might do in the future for our own county. So that's one way we might do it. I see this as really sort of, when you think about what people feel and what they experience, you're like, oh, how do you measure that? What do you do with that? What does government do with that? And it makes me think of our conversation around public safety in general, right? Like, oh, some people say they don't feel safe simply because there's a presence of a homeless person, for example, in the area, and that makes them feel unsafe, right? So what do you do with that? But nevertheless, there are things that we can do to do that. So, for example, all of the things that we've done to address homelessness in our community are things that do ultimately lead to people's feelings changing around that issue. So, for example, when we are housing people in clearing encampments and we are housing them in permanent supportive housing, when we are increasing our walking patrol, when we are doing things like combining our home fund with the county, all of these actions lead to doing bigger and more expansive actions or projects that ultimately has an impact on people's experience and how they feel. And so I don't necessarily feel sort of, I guess you could say, discouraged. I feel like there are things that we could do to try to chip away at some of what people say they feel and what they experience by doing tangible things that will hopefully lead to the way people say they experience and feel it. And just because people feel it, it shouldn't be dismissed, right? We should care about it, which is why we're doing this work. I think at the heart of it is we care. Even if it is just a feeling, especially when it's the numbers that we're seeing, it's a pretty significant number of people in our community, and we should care. And so hopefully our future actions lead to a significant increase in people having a more positive experience in our community. And the last thing I'll say about it is that holds up a mirror to our community because we're a progressive city. And I would say that, that is probably puts us probably even at more risk to some extent because we think we've arrived and that we don't have more work to do, but we certainly do. And so, and this shows that. So I thank you for your work. And this will help us do more to use that equity lens that we talk about a lot in the work that we do going forward to try to address some of these very systemic issues in our community. So thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Nguyen, followed by Councilmember Parsley.
Thank you, Mayor. That was really well put. I'd like to just rattle off a couple of things that I jot down as far as ideas for next steps. And they are just that in idea form. So I think of, I understand, Toby, you are going to share with council a list of the partners that were involved in this and helping sort of seek out participants. So knowing that, I also think about sharing with our current partners. So I think like the Olympia Downtown Alliance, other different, they're a big partner of ours. So other sort of like partners, the Hands-On Children's Museum, partnerships that we already have that would be just really, really useful information too. So I think about sharing it with them. I also think about different ways that we could weave it into our current efforts. So public safety came up. So there was a lot of work already on reimagining public safety in Olympia, and I see this as another layer to that. I also, just even with the housing and then the employment one alone, and other areas in here, I think about Olympia Strong comes up for me quite a bit. And then I think kind of how can we, what can we do as City of Olympia government, just within the organization itself. So I think about city staff. I know there's going to be a briefing to city staff coming up here soon, and I'm really, really interested in how we marry their experiences and ensure that this is not happening within the organization, right? And I would bet that it probably is, and it probably is a little bit at every organization. And so I just think about that. So we think about, of course, our broader Olympia community, but also, is our house in order before we go organizing everything else? So I think about that. And also, part of the equity framework and doing it well, or the climate framework, is for people to, one, understand how to fill it out, right? And then also care about it. You could have, we have some of the best and the brightest in the city of Olympia, and having that kind of skin in the game, and if folks can relate this to their own experiences or their experiences of their loved ones, I think we're only going to see things like the equity framework flourish. So involvement with city staff, and I'm really pleased that that's already scheduled. I also think about so there's discrimination, which always feels like this big wrong, right? Like this big thing happening, and then I too, along with other colleagues I've mentioned, really appreciate diminishment, and the value of bringing that up, right? Sort of before it gets to discrimination, if you will. So there's diminishment and then impediments. And so I think about how do we put it as a forefront in our meetings, in our interactions with each other, in our interactions out in community meetings. So what's a way of doing that? And maybe it's adding it to our set of working agreements or values, or maybe it's literally having it right there, what those actions are. I'm not sure. I'm less worried about, where it would be written down, and more about, hey, how do we weave that in a way that makes sense, in a way that we can help each other remember. And I would be pleased as pie for someone to say, oh, in keeping with ensuring that everyone is respected, we're doing this, and like how can my colleagues gently remind me? How can I remind other folks? I also, this is sort of brings us back to like the belonging work, or something you had said, Toby, about just keeping the conversation alive. I think one of the council members said that as well, is like just knowing this, having this, and sitting with this is so important. So I agree, and I also am very interested in what does it look like to have sort of almost like regular like community conversations or cafes about this, and have the city participate and provide resources in a way that makes sense. It might not be, fully hosting it. It could just be having the space. I know our Parks Department puts on all sorts of programming, so I don't know if it's appropriate through them, but I would be really, really interested in how do we do whatever we can to hold space for different community members coming together, and not just as a one-time thing, but how can we make it sustainable? How can we introduce different concepts on it? Just last week, whoever was here for that sort of public comment portion, we were reminded again of how different we all are, how different our ideologies are, our perspectives, and I'm reminded all the time when I do anything like look up the news at all, so that is, political was not one of the categories in here, though I'd be very curious. Even just like our different belief systems, and so how do we, I don't know about everyone else, so this is, rhetorical, but I'm feeling stressed out of our political climate itself, just in the broader context. And I can feel that other folks' stress as well whenever they give me the gift of sharing. So I guess all that to say is that this report is not about politics necessarily, but there's always room for understanding. There's always room for acknowledging that there are truly good people on, that identify as so many different identities and are on all sides of issues. And so what is our role as a city government? What's appropriate for us in helping the culture of our community, helping community members be in community with each other in respectful ways? So, and I think that we certainly have a role there. So, just something I'm thinking of. This also reminds me a lot about conversations I've had with other colleagues and city staff about the importance of civility and people being able to participate in civic processes. So, anyway, just some thoughts.
Thank you so much for that. That's a lot of helpful feedback. I do want to note on a couple of things that I think I can answer at least a little bit right now. And for one, like addressing things internally and where might this be occurring within staff, that's actually part of the focus of the internal equity assessment. And one of the key factors of that is looking at, we've been using the this isn't my body of work, so I don't want to speak on behalf of others a whole bunch, but we have had a belonging barometer to give to staff to kind of create a sense of like who feels a sense of belonging in their workplace here, and where people can or don't feel like they can bring their whole authentic self to work. And there's some clear issues there to follow up on. And there's conversations happening within, as a part of the assessment within departments to address that. And then also, like, how can we be aware of where we may be causing diminishment or where we may be like interacting with the public? I think that there are some helpful trainings or best practices for just like how to intervene when you see something happening, or how to understand and talk about you know, like when something happens that it feels important to call out. How do you do that in an effective way that makes people impacted feel held and supported, while also making sure that people who may have not understood what they were doing are still a part of the conversation and can be carried forward with it. And then just I want to thank you for bringing up the piece about like political climate and how that impacts people's experiences around that. I know it's not something that we talk about very much in our attempts to not be political, but I think that there is some clear information that when people's human rights are up for debate, when they're up for vote, when they're up for legislation, we see discrimination and hate violence against those groups increase. And so that is something to be aware of as we're looking at the current political climate in the next several months.
City Manager Bernie, followed by Councilmember Parsley.
Sorry, Councilmember Parsley, I just wanted to comment here just to add on to some of Toby's comments. And I think one of you said, you know, what's really important is that we work to get our own house in order. And I couldn't agree more with that. And Toby mentioned, you know, our internal equity assessment. We formed a Belonging and Equity Action Team that's going to be doing similar work that the Social Justice and Equity Commission will be doing, is taking what the results of that report is and working with me and the executive team to figure out what are the interventions and things that we need to do. Some of that is launched. You just got a presentation on our employee resource groups. That's an example of some of the work that's already launched ahead of kind of waiting for the final results of our equity assessment. I think, you know, all of our employees are required to take 17 and a half hours of belonging training. And that's something that we didn't wait for the equity assessment to get here. We started that work already. So there's work underway. And certainly our job is not done. Toby mentioned those who don't feel like they can show up as their authentic selves. I think the number is 41%. So 41% of our workforce, for a variety of reasons, don't always feel like they can show up as their authentic self. That's work. That's work we have to do internally to get our house in order. If our employees aren't feeling that way, how are they going to make others feel that way? So I just wanted to add on to what Toby commented on.
Thanks, Jay. Councilmember Parsley, finally.
No. This is all good. I'm soaking it all in as the introvert. I have a note to myself, though. I've always had one. It's bad to speak after the mayor does. Now I think I have to put in there the mayor pro tem, because that was very. You were more eloquent in where I was going with some of this, and I've sat with it like Robert and all of us, and some of this is going to impact us, but I'm also thinking, well, my two things was the police training. How is this going to impact the police, especially the section under interactions with the different, group? Is it going to affect their training? How is that going to go? And do we change our training? And how does that also go to the auditor? Because the auditor is now going to be handling complaints. So those are some of my thoughts. And then wondering, and I don't want to press Jay, when this equity assessment might make it back to council so we can hear a little bit about it.
Yeah, most of the work is wrapped up. What was waiting to be done was the final interviews within departments. There's work individually within departments to do some work there. That work just wrapped up. The Belonging and Equity Action Team is going to get their first look at the data at their September meeting, I believe, is what the schedule calls for. And then we're planning a retreat. And I also sit on the Belonging and Equity Action Team, so our employees have a direct line to me with those recommendations. So that work is forthcoming, and as I mentioned to you before, at some point in time in the future, we will bring that work to the city council so you can see kind of what our work looks like and our work plan looks like internally as well.
That's a huge lift. My last thing is, the longer I've sat with this, the more I realize, I guess it goes with one of the other hats I wear, which is climate work. And the cities and the jurisdictions are only going to be so much. We're going to have to rely on our communities to do most of it. So how do we bring our community into this work and this information, and how do we educate them? And the community conversations absolutely is there any reaching out to our partners that we haven't reached out to? Educating, as the Mayor Pro Tem said, there's a lot of good ideas, but I think we should be making that one of ours, because I'm betting there's some people out there that would read this report and go, oh my, and then begin to look at their own actions. People who hire, small businesses, small landlords, people that interact in coffee shops, which is one of my favorite places in the world. But, those kinds of things. How do we move this out into the community to have them help us?
Thank you. You said it's the Belonging Equity Action Team. Do you call that BEAT?
BEAT.
Okay. Just hearing about it. Okay. I believe Assistant City Manager Sullivan had a point to make on this, and then we'll go to Councilmember Vanderpool.
Thank you. And I'm the chief isn't here, so I may not do a really good job responding, but when we were going through the community oversight of law enforcement recommendation, the idea of training for police, training for our community board, training for the auditor, having shared training around these types of issues was really elevated and is in the implementation considerations. So he's very aware of it and very committed to doing that work. And I don't know if Stacey, if you wanted to add anything else to that. So.
Thank you. Councilmember Vanderpool.
So a thought came to me from both ends as we're talking about community spaces and this. A thought came to me was spaces of belonging. And so one of the things I think we can probably do as a city, because I think in spatial terms, I think of our parks, I think of our right-of-ways we own, and I think of our partnerships out there with businesses. And I think about, how do we create and foster spaces of belonging, even with spaces that we own, as in parks and plazas and places that people feel comfortable being in? And so part of that conversation about, creating those groups isn't just about education, but about places where they feel that they're comfortable with people that they also self-identify with, right? And so maybe trying to think of that in, again, the parks that we have, right? Do they meet the needs of people that would typically just not go to them because it doesn't identify with them, or some businesses downtown, or businesses all over the city, or so places of belonging, I think, could foster as those third places that I like to talk about as those things that can help foster and grow the community and allow members of the community to kind of feel at home in Olympia rather than, kind of away or discriminated or afraid of going out in the world.
Yes. Any other questions? Well, thank you. I know that this was a study session for us to learn about the report, but you're not going to get no actions going forward from this council. It's just not going to happen. So thank you for your time. We look forward to hearing from the Social Justice and Equity Commission at their retreat and seeing how that discussion went, and eventually what policy recommendations they may even have going forward. And so we certainly look forward to working with them on that. And lastly, we just want to thank our consultants on your work. Once again, thank you so much. We obviously wouldn't be able to do this work without you. So any other questions or comments? All right, so that concludes our business for the study session. And at this time, we will recess for 5 minutes. and then reconvene in room 423 for up to 60 minutes for an executive session pursuant to litigation and potential litigation. No decisions will be made, after which we will be adjourned for the evening.